Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Bitcoin dominance, of course, is everyone's favorite topic, and for good reason. For good reason. The general idea behind Bitcoin dominance is that when you can identify it in a macro uptrend, which is what we did on here back in 2021, early 2022, then the best strategy for a lot of people would be to maintain a Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio. Now, the reason for that is because in Bitcoin dominance uptrends, most, but not all, altcoins bleed to Bitcoin. And I just want to be clear when I talk about most altcoins bleeding to Bitcoin, and I've mentioned this several times over the last few weeks, I am not talking about your altcoin. I would not dream of dunking on your altcoin. I'm sure that you have properly vetted all the altcoins in your portfolio, that they are in uptrends against Bitcoin, and they are not rug pulls, right? So I'm not talking about your altcoin. I'm talking about everyone else's altcoin, right? The people that did not find alts that were in uptrends against Bitcoin. Those are the altcoins that I'm mostly referring to. And of course, in any Bitcoin dominance uptrend, right, you can always cherry pick a few alts that are outpouring Bitcoin, but the reality is that most of them have in fact been bleeding to Bitcoin over the last several years. And you can see right now that Bitcoin dominance is right around that 61% milestone. So then the question is, when will Bitcoin dominance actually top out? I have said that it makes sense to be open-minded to it going higher into the end of the year. I think it will probably top out within the next 6 to 7 weeks. I do reserve the right to pivot on that if quantitative tightening continues, but to me, it seems like there is a decent chance that QT will come to an end at some point within the next couple of months. If I'm wrong about that, which is a good chance I could be, then it would still make sense to ride the Bitcoin dominance uptrend for as long as possible. But right now, Bitcoin dominance is right around 61%. Now, if you look at dominance with this, so this is dominance including stablecoins, right? Dominance including stablecoins. And what's really interesting is, in November of 2020, it was actually at the same level that it's at today, right? Which is remarkable. I mean, exactly 4 years later, dominance, including stablecoins, is at the exact same level that it was 4 years ago. And we know that, there's a cyclical component to the cryptoverse, right? Now, what's really interesting, though, of course, is distinguishing between whether we are here or whether we are here. Now, obviously, everyone hopes that we're here. And we'll talk about that, right? We'll talk about what could help us identify that that is in fact where we are. There's a chance that we're still here. And there's a main difference between those 2 points, right? There's a fundamental difference, because if we are in fact at this moment here where dominance goes into, say, its final move up and then drops down, then that would of course be the alt season that everyone wants. If, on the other hand, we are here and we go up, then whenever it drops back down, it won't be the same thing as what you saw over here. So there's a clear distinction between the two. Also, I don't think that dominance will go to 73%, right? I don't think it will go that high. I know a lot of people are now pivoting to the Bitcoin dominance train, many other people pivoting to it were very bearish on it when it was at 40%. So go figure, right? Now that it's at 61%, of course, they jump on the bandwagon. But I don't think it will go as high as that. Now, I've said before, 60% was sort of like the minimum target. And I even posted one of the things I'd posted in ITC Premium a while back about how I was never concerned about Bitcoin dominance reaching 60%. I was more so wondering how much above 60% would it in fact go. And now, so far, we've seen Bitcoin dominance go to 61%. Now, if you're not familiar with why 60% was a conservative target, basically, when you think about bubbles that form between like altcoins and Bitcoin, you can see that, essentially altcoins were returning back to where they broke down from, right? That was where they basically were returning to. And so that was the reason why 60% dominance seemed like a very likely outcome, just to see that bubble, the alt Bitcoin bubble, pop, and for the cryptoverse to essentially heal. I think a lot of people don't like it when Bitcoin dominance goes up, but it actually represents, healing in the cryptoverse. And also, the higher Bitcoin dominance goes, then in the future, the more it could theoretically fall. So as I've said, don't fear Bitcoin dominance going higher. It's just a natural part of the cycle. And one of the important things about crypto, rather than fight the different parts of the cycle, it's better to learn to embrace those parts of the cycle, right? Don't fight the trend. Embrace it until the trend tells you it's time to reverse course. Now, it's possible that Bitcoin dominance tops out at any moment, right? It's certainly possible. And, as I've said, I do think it makes sense to take the maxi hat off at this point, because there's no guarantee that dominance has to go that much higher. But the one thing that keeps me open, I guess there's a few things, right? The one thing, right? There's probably like 5 things, right? But the main things that keep me open-minded to Bitcoin dominance going higher are things like alt Bitcoin pairs, right? If you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, the chart that everyone should have saved on TradingView, and if you don't, then I don't know what you're doing, right? I mean, this is an important chart. It's total 3. Let me write it out like this. So it's total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. So we're basically taking everything besides Bitcoin and ETH, subtracting out USDT, dividing it by the Bitcoin market cap, and then you get this chart. And what I have said over and over and over again for the last few years is that altcoins are oscillators at best, right? At best. Now, I don't need to hear what great thing your altcoin has accomplished, because you're not comparing your altcoin against Bitcoin 4 years ago. You're comparing your altcoin against what Bitcoin is today, right? So don't tell me the major accomplishments your meme coin has had over the last 4 years and why it should be at a higher valuation today against Bitcoin than it was back then. I don't want to hear that. Tell me why it deserves a higher valuation against Bitcoin today, given what Bitcoin is today. Today, Bitcoin's a lot different than it was 4 years ago, right? I mean, there's obviously a lot more attention on Bitcoin today than there was 4 years ago. We didn't have ETFs back then. We didn't have institutions getting interested in the same way. So, you cannot come at me with that argument, right? It doesn't make sense to say that, it shouldn't be a bleeder just because of something, Again, I'm not talking about your alt. I'm talking about the other people watching's altcoin. So I think it makes sense to view the market, the altcoin market, as an oscillator against Bitcoin. That doesn't necessarily need to be what you want to hear, but it has been a reality of the cryptoverse that the altcoin market, whether you like it or not, tends to top out when the altcoin market cap reaches parity with Bitcoin. So see 0.99, Basically, if it's 1, that means the altcoin market cap is the same as Bitcoin's market cap. That's where the altcoin market tends to top out against Bitcoin. So whenever that happens, probably a good idea to run for the hills in terms of your alts, right? And then it bottoms out around 25% of Bitcoin's market cap. You see that? I mean, it's pretty clear. Tops at parity, bottoms at a quarter. And now it's at 0.37. So the good news is that if my view is correct, alts only have to drop another 33% against Bitcoin. 33%, that might sound like a lot, but if you take it from the top, where we first started talking about it, it was 74%. 74 to 75%. What's another 33%, right? So it seems to me that the most likely outcome is for altcoins to still bleed against Bitcoin, because I consider them to be oscillators at best. Now, I've talked about that, like at best. Why do I keep saying that? That's the glass half full approach. There's also the glass half empty approach for the pessimists among us and the Bitcoin maxis, right? And to ignore the other view is probably misguided. You probably shouldn't ignore it just because you don't want to think about the alternative outcome. There does exist a scenario where even if alt Bitcoin pairs do drop to 0.25, it doesn't actually mark the true bottom. Now, what type of scenario, what evidence is there in the chart for that, right? Well, the glass half full approach would basically say that this is a deviation above the range high, this is a deviation below the range low, and then just ignore, just focus on, what happened outside of those two deviations, right? It goes up to the top of the range, to the bottom, to the top, to the bottom, right? And then just keeps on moving like that. That is one obvious outcome. And there's got to be a chance that that's what happens, right? There's got to be. But there's also another reality, a sobering reality, that would probably be foolish to ignore this. And that is the fact that alt Bitcoin pairs have also been putting in lower highs and lower lows. So when I say oscillators at best, they're bleeders at worst, right? So that was the reason why 60% dominance never felt like it was going to be that difficult to achieve. Because if alt Bitcoin pairs were to just simply go back down to oscillators at best, then that easily gets you above 60%, right? If you're the glass half empty person, you'll notice that these are lower highs and lower lows. So there is a chance that it plays out like that. One potential thing to think about that could happen, and I don't really think a lot of people are thinking about it like this, but I'll throw it out there just in case it ends up sticking. Last cycle, when alt Bitcoin pairs hit 0.25, right here in September of 2019, you see that? It happened when the Fed pivoted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. So if you look here, this blue line, this is the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, that is quantitative tightening. And then QE began, quantitative easing. And so it was when the Fed pivoted from QT to QE, that's when alt Bitcoin pairs hit 0.25. So this is where it gets interesting, because, there's two primary outcomes here with alt Bitcoin pairs that I think are worth our attention. One of which, and I am somewhat sick right now, which is why I'm kind of struggling. I'm stuck in traffic on Struggle Street. But, if you look at a chart like this, there does exist I think everyone's kind of expecting something like this, where if my view on alt Bitcoin pairs is right, they're thinking it'll just come down and then immediately go back up to the top of the channel, right? I think that's what a lot of people think is the most likely outcome. And there is a chance that that view is in fact correct. But if that view is to be correct, it means that if you go over to the social risk, we need to see a durable uptrend in this, right? It's already spiked a lot. It's basically back to where it was in March and in April. So in order for alt season to begin the way you remember it, we need to see this happen, where the social risk keeps on climbing. We need to see the fear and greed index continue to print in the 90s. We already got 2 data points there. But we also had 2 in 2019. We had 1 here in 2024. If you look back 4 years ago, this is when we got the fear and greed index into the 90s for a couple of months. And that is what brought retail back to the table, right? So the question is are we going to see this again? If we see that again, then there's a much higher chance that alt Bitcoin pairs could get sort of a final drop and then go back up to the top of the range. But you know how a lot of people have compared this cycle to 2016, 2017? You should know that the main rally by alt Bitcoin pairs in the 2016 to 2017 cycle didn't even occur until November of the post-halving year, right? So that would be another full year from now, which is kind of mind-boggling to think about, that there is a chance it could still be a year away. Is that possible? Well, first of all, I would say keep an eye on the fear and greed index. Keep an eye on the social risk. Again, those are available at ITC Premium. We do have the sale going on. Links in the description below. If those continue to go up, then it would be more likely you get something like this, where you get a quick capitulation and then up. If those don't continue to see that same type of movement, there's always a chance that we're just simply here, where then after they capitulate to 0.25, they just sort of bounce around for a while and then go up like that. There is a chance that that's what happens, right? Where they go down to the range lows, everyone expects alt season, but they just kind of bounce around like this. And then maybe Bitcoin dominance gets another rally a year after QE begins. And then perhaps it truly does go way down here. Which is kind of crazy to think about. I mean, that's not necessarily my base case at this point, but it's got to be at least something on your radar. And then you get alt season. There is a chance that that's what happens. And that way you would basically have sort of the lower high structure in place, the lower low structure in place, but you still get your alt season. So that is kind of what I think it makes the most sense to think about right now, because last cycle when QE began, that alt season was still a year away, right? I mean, it was still more than a year away. So I don't really know how it's going to shape up this time. I'm open-minded to either outcome, honestly. I'd like to see. I mean, if the fear and greed index goes back into the 90s and stays there for a couple more months, like let's say it stays there for a month and a half, there's a really good chance that a lot of that money from Bitcoin will just sort of pour into the altcoin market after the Bitcoin dominance rally is over. But I just want people to remember that there's always multiple ways to look at the market. And there's evidence that we are here because it's the same in terms of time in the Cryptoverse. This is November. We're currently in November of 2024. Here. Sorry. We're currently in November of 2024, and this is November 2020. The cyclical view would suggest we're more likely here than we are over here. The QT-QE view, more of the monetary policy view, would suggest that there's a chance that we're still right here, right? Where, there is a drop and then alt Bitcoin pairs bounce, but it doesn't lead to the same type of bounce that everyone's necessarily expecting. So it's important to remember that there's always going to be more than one plausible outcome. And you probably shouldn't get married to either outcome. The reality, though, is until proven otherwise, and it could be proven otherwise at any moment, regardless of whether we are here or here, there's a good chance that alt Bitcoin pairs will continue to bleed. Because whether you buy into this view or the cyclical part of it, the outcome for both of them was that alt Bitcoin pairs went down. Now remember, alt Bitcoin pairs going down does not mean that alt USD pairs have to. It just depends on what Bitcoin does. If Bitcoin USD goes up, then there's a good chance the altcoins would go up on their USD pairs, even if they're bleeding on their Bitcoin pairs. If Bitcoin USD goes down, then the altcoin market on their USD pairs also likely goes down. But the point of identifying the Bitcoin dominance rally 3 years ago was that no one can predict exactly where the market's going to go, right? No one, including and especially myself. No one can predict it. But at any given moment, people want to take on risk. And when you decide to take on that risk, where do you take it on? Do you take it on in the altcoin market? Do you take it on with Bitcoin? And during Bitcoin dominance rallies, you're usually better off sticking with the kink. That doesn't mean you can't make money on some altcoins even during Bitcoin dominance rallies. It just means you're going to have to cherry pick those. Okay? And again, I'm not talking about your properly vetted great community altcoin. I'm talking about all the others. So the other thing to consider when it comes to, to Bitcoin dominance is to look at the year-to-date ROI of it in halving years, right? And also to look at it in 2019, a year that the Fed cut rates. If you look at dominance without stablecoins, so Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, if you look at it in 2019 and compare it to 2024, it's really similar, right? And I mean, it really is a very similar thing. Obviously, over here, dominance topped out in September, and it's continued to go higher this year. But I think the reason it topped in September last in 2019 and it still keeps going up this time is because we haven't seen that pivot to QE. Okay? So it might just kind of keep going up into the end of the year like it did in 2019. But you can also compare this to 2023 and see that it's following a very similar path, right? It is. That doesn't mean it can't fall off at the end of the year. It's possible that it could. It depends on if QE happens. I mean, if they introduce QE in a few weeks, then perhaps Bitcoin dominance will drop. But it just hasn't happened yet, right? And if you look at just prior halving years, you can see that dominance normally goes up at the end of the halving year, right? In Q4 of the halving year, Bitcoin dominance normally goes up. So, the evidence is still there to suggest that Bitcoin dominance could in fact go higher. And by the way, this rally by alt Bitcoin pairs that we've seen in mid-November is something we talked about ahead of time, right? I've said many times that we would likely get a rally by alt Bitcoin pairs in mid-November because that's exactly what happened in mid-November of 2020. And you will see, in fact, that they got rejected at the 20-week moving average. And they got rejected at 0.39. They're currently at 0.37. But back then, they got rejected at 0.39, I believe it was, if I get the wick there. And then today, so far, the rejection has occurred a little higher, I guess, 0.4. But this 0.4, it's important because it's the same level that was once support for alt Bitcoin pairs, right? And what I said many times is that the way this would play out is that eventually, in order to really break down and sustain it, you'll need to see the bull market support band go below support. And then once it has, now alt Bitcoin pairs keep getting rejected. And on weekly time frames, they keep getting rejected by the bull market support band. Same exact thing happened in November of 2020. You see that? I mean, it was almost a carbon copy. Rally by alt Bitcoin pairs. And then they topped out the week of November 23rd. On the daily time frame, back then, alt Bitcoin pairs topped out on November 24th, right? On November 24th. So 4 days from now is when they topped out. And you can see what happened is that after they had that rally in mid-November, they then dropped for 40 days. And then finally, they hit their bottom. Now that's the question. Are we there, or are we here? Where alt Bitcoin pairs were also at the same level, right? They had this little rally right here, up, and they still bled then for about 65 days to the range lows. Now, the thing about this is, remember, when they made that final bleed back then, it was going into the final period of quantitative tightening. Because when the Fed pivoted, that's when alt Bitcoin pairs hit that low. And then they started basically a year-long uptrend before then getting another drop when Bitcoin went parabolic again. So it's really difficult to know, exactly where we are right here. If we're going into this move or whether we're going into this one. But the beauty of it, and again, it's probably going to get harder in a month or two to try to decipher this. But the beauty of it right now is that whether you believe we're here or whether you believe we're here, it was the same outcome, right? I mean, it was the same outcome. Now, I guess the elephant in the room is that what if we're not in either of those places and something completely different happens, which there's a good chance it could. And it's not like it's impossible to sort of think about other outcomes, right? One of the outcomes that we've talked about a lot for Bitcoin is following the cyclical view, right? The cyclical view of Bitcoin, and basically doing what it always does. Now, we talk about, a lot of people talk about how this time is different and everything seems different this time, but it really hasn't been. If you look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in halving years, it's doing the same thing it's always done, right? I mean, it really is. 2012, 2016, 2020, Bitcoin USD year-to-date ROI is the same as it always is. In fact, if you average out 2012, 2016, and 2020 year-to-date ROI, and then overlay it with 2024, we're basically at the same spot we always are at this point in the cycle. This stuff, will often repeat itself. Look at just 2024 compared to 2023. They look so similar to each other. It's not just Bitcoin, right? I mean, look at Nvidia. Nvidia's been a stock that's done really well. Look at 2024 compared to 2023, right? They're almost carbon copies of each other. The main difference is that 2024 has been a slightly weaker version of 2023. Not only for Nvidia, but also Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin's ROI in 2023 was a little bit better than it has been in 2024. Not by a lot, but there's a difference, right? There was a difference there. So, I have to think about the fact that, there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's just doing what it always does. If you look at ROI from the bottom for Bitcoin, and you just look at the market cycle ROI, this is, it's right in between the last two cycles at this point, right? I mean, you see that, right? I mean, at this point in the cycle, it's basically right in between the last two cycles as measured from the low. So when you think about it like that, I mean, it doesn't really seem like Bitcoin's doing anything different than it always does when you look at the market like that. The only other way to look at the market was the monetary policy view that we previously discussed. But I said, as long as the unemployment rate comes in low, which it did 3 weeks ago, then we should defer to the cyclical view. And it's dangerous to fade the Bitcoin momentum, right? Now, there is something we need to at least talk about, and I'm only going to mention it because there's two pieces of evidence that could suggest that it's at least worth our consideration in the short term. In a year from now, it probably doesn't matter. In 6 months from now, it probably doesn't matter. But there's two things I want us to think about over the next few weeks, right? And that is, so Bitcoin right now is at 93.7, right? There's on the path to 100. There's a similarity between, the launch of the Bitcoin ETF and the launch of QQQ back in 1999. If you go look at the launch of QQQ back in 1999, what you'll notice is that it also launched at 48, essentially, right? I mean, if you look at this low right there, it was around 48, which is really funny because when the ETF for Bitcoin launched, it was around 48K. And you can see that it's been a long time consolidating, and then eventually it had this strong rally, and as it approached 100, it got some major rejections along the way, right? So first it went up to 96, and then it dropped to 80, or around 80. Then it went up to 97, and then it dropped to 84. So it was a difficult process to break through. Okay? So it might not just be a simple rally to 100K. Now, it could be. I'm not saying it can't happen, but you have to remember that the markets move in a stochastic fashion, right? They're not just going to go exactly one direction always. So there could be a chance that you get a sell-off before breaking that major milestone. And it would be interesting if that happened, because if you guys remember the monetary policy view, which I think it made sense to defer away from to the cyclical view once the unemployment rate came in low, but it wasn't that long ago when the monetary policy view was serving us quite well for about 7 months. You guys remember that? We talked all year about this outcome. All year. And a lot of people didn't want to believe it. They're like, no way. It does the same thing. This was back in March. Everyone was calling for new all-time highs up to 100K back then. And what ended up happening was Bitcoin went down for it took about 30 weeks to break out. Same thing over here, right? It took about 30 weeks to break out. But here's where it gets interesting, right? Here's where it gets interesting is after the breakout, Bitcoin had 2 weekly candles that were pretty impressive. And then the following 2 weeks, you can see the very next week, it did go to an all-time high. Not an all-time high, but a new high compared to this rally. It went to a new high, and then you got a landing. Now, certainly I'm not thinking that it's going to play out like that, right? Because, again, you're not going to get a pandemic-induced recession in the next 3 weeks. But I could see a scenario where, especially as Bitcoin tries to approach that 100K milestone, just like when the QQQ launched, I could see a scenario where there is a sort of a sell-off that makes people think it's going to be really bad, and then it just ends up, finding support somewhere and then making that move back up, just like the QQQ did. So there's always a chance that you get some form of a pullback, right, like that, on the approach to the 100 milestone. And if you do get that, I don't know how low it would go. QQQ essentially went up to 96 and then dropped to 80. So I don't know. Obviously, when this thing broke out, it went to a little over 10K, and then it dropped all the way to 4K. Right? That was a major drop. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. There is a chance that Bitcoin could just run to 100K. The convenient thing about all this analysis is that as an investor, if you're trying to figure out, where do you put your money? If it's a Bitcoin dominance uptrend, you're better off in Bitcoin than altcoins. And if there is a drop like this, guess what's going to get hit hardest? It's going to be the altcoins. right? No, I'm not saying Bitcoin can't get hit hard, but it just seems like if there is a landing and Bitcoin gets rejected off the first approach to 100K, the altcoin market's probably going to get wrecked more, right? And that's exactly what happened here when Bitcoin went down after QE came back. So that's the reason why we talk about Bitcoin dominance so much, is because everyone accepts that the path, bull markets, right? The path to highs is not a linear process, right? I mean, it's a stochastic process. And, when there are scares in the market, altcoins likely get sold off harder. And, the other thing is, if you look at USDT dominance, this thing, my base case is that eventually it breaks down at some point, because it can't go up forever, because it would imply that eventually USDT dominance goes above 100%, which is nonsensical. But it's struggling to break through here, right? Just like it's always struggled to break through before. And so sometimes what happens, and what you've been witnessing over the last couple of weeks, is that Bitcoin's going higher, but USDT dominance isn't really going lower. One of the reasons for that is because alts keep dropping, right? Alts are not rallying with Bitcoin for the most part. So Bitcoin is basically taking the liquidity from altcoins and saying, thank you very much. Furthermore, the reason why USDT dominance isn't going down is because USDT market cap is essentially going parabolic, right? I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the USDT market cap was at 120 billion, and then now it's at 129 almost, right? I mean, this is a pretty big move by the USDT market cap in a really short period of time. So as long as they keep minting more Tether, right? As long as that keeps happening, even if Bitcoin goes up, it doesn't mean that USDT dominance trend line will break, right? I mean, if it just keeps going up, if Bitcoin goes up commensurate with USDT market cap, then everything can still be true, right? I mean, you could still have, a Bitcoin slowly going up, but that trend line not breaking, just simply because USDT market cap is going up and because altcoins are bleeding back to Bitcoin. A lot of alts just haven't really done a whole lot. And until you see a durable rally in the social risk, it makes sense to defer alt season to a later time. You can see Bitcoin dominance is now at 61%, right? I mean, it's at 61%. And one of the reasons why I thought that 60% would be an easy milestone to achieve is if you look at sort of a fib retracement from the last cycle, you can see that Bitcoin dominance retraced to the 0.618 fib. This time, the 618 was 60%. It's going above that now. The next level on here is the 786, and that's all the way up at 68 or 66%. Could dominance go as high as 66%? It's possible. I mean, like one thing to think about is that dominance is putting in higher lows, but what if it's also putting in, say, lower highs? Something like that, right? Where the outcome is you're putting in these higher lows, but you're also putting in lower highs. So what if that is the target, right? What if it goes as high as 66%? Everyone then calls for it to go to 73, which is where it went last cycle. But the reason it doesn't go there, more than likely, is because the USDT market cap, USDT dominance, is a lot higher today than it was back then, right? I mean, back over here, USDT dominance was only at like 2%. Today, it's at over 4%. So that is going to have some effect. Right? And I've seen a lot of people say the only reason Bitcoin dominance is going up is because ETH Bitcoin is going down, which, by the way, we called this collapse by ETH Bitcoin long ago, right? Before it was cool to dunk on the ETH Bitcoin valuation, we were here saying ETH Bitcoin is going to collapse. And you're seeing the calls for it. Everyone's sort of dunking on ETH Bitcoin now. I'm going to defer to what I've seen historically and say good chance ETH Bitcoin bottoms out either December or here, on this drop in the halving year, it bottomed out sort of late December, early January. So I think there's a good chance it'll do something like that, where it bottoms out by the end of the year. or the early part of next year. That's my base case. But you can't tell me and expect me to take you seriously that the only reason dominance is going up is because of ETH. Because if you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, right? If you look at that and you take 1 over that, if you take 1 over that, actually, you know what? I don't want to take 1 over that. I want to plot 1 over Bitcoin dominance. If you plot 1 over Bitcoin dominance, and let me switch this to a new scale, you can also see that they're basically identical, right? I mean, it's not just because of ETH that Bitcoin dominance is going up, because total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin does not include ETH at all. And you can see that it's almost a perfect correlation. So get that argument out of here, right? I don't want to hear that argument. That's a cope argument that the only reason it's going up is because of ETH. No, that's not true. A lot of alts are bleeding back to Bitcoin. Just because some micro-cap meme coin rug pull is up 2x this week doesn't mean that most alts aren't bleeding back to Bitcoin. If you look at others, where is it? Others Bitcoin. We've talked about this forever. What did it do last cycle? Same thing it's doing this cycle. But no one cares to believe it. But it's doing the same exact thing. And you know what it is? It's others Bitcoin dropped 60% into the pause. This blue line is our interest rates, the Federal Reserve interest rates. Then it rallied 60% into the pause, or halfway through the terminal rate pause. And then it dropped another 60 as rate cuts arrived. It's doing the same exact thing this cycle for anyone who cares to look at it, right? I mean, 60% down into the pause, 60% up about halfway through, and then another 60% down, and X marks the spot, right? And then they're already at 0.15. If they go down here, that gets you to around 0.1. Same exact thing as last cycle. Same exact thing. And I can't tell you how many people have been bullish on others Bitcoin for the last 3 years. And it just keeps on going lower. They'll be right eventually. But you know, last cycle, when it bottomed, others Bitcoin started going up. But it didn't get this big move until almost a year later, right? So again, there's no guarantee that the alt season that you think immediately has to start even starts right away. It's going to depend on whether the fear and greed index stays euphoric for the next month and a half. If it can, then there's a good chance you could get it. If it doesn't, then you might have to kick the can down the road for a year. And believe me, I think the degens calling for alt season are very well versed in kicking the can down the road, because that's basically what they had to do for the last 3 years. Remember, alt season is when altcoins durably outperform Bitcoin. Okay? It's pretty clear where alt season is on the charts. This was alt season, right? This was alt season. But these moves here, right? This is not alt season, right? This is Bitcoin season. So the yellow, these ovals right here show you Bitcoin dominance uptrends where Bitcoin season is. Now, I don't know exactly where dominance is going to top out. I don't. I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could tell you. My only thought process for the last 3 years was that 60% is a reasonable conservative target. Once we're there, we'll look around and see. And I gotta say, you know, we're at 61% now, and I look around and see, and I still see alt Bitcoin pairs off their range lows. Now, remember, I told you guys to remind me of this, and you haven't. If you add in here USDC, they're actually a little bit closer, right? They're already at 0.35, not 0.37. And the low is still theoretically around 0.25. So there's a chance that alt Bitcoin pairs only need to drop another 27% rather than, say, like 30-something percent in order to get down to the range lows. But anyways, guys, these trends on dominance have been talked about for years now. I hope that some people were able to preserve the Satoshi valuation of their portfolio. I hope so. Because I learned the lesson the hard way in prior cycles, and I remember thinking, hell, I should have stayed Bitcoin only until December of the halving year or January of the post-halving year, and it would have been a hell of a lot better than trying to time all these altcoin rallies. And by the way, if you look at Bitcoin dominance, excluding stablecoins, we talked about the 65% target, which we hit. This is excluding stables. Now, the two most likely outcomes at this point are what I just drew right here, right? I'll just talk about them. One outcome is where they just kind of get a rounded top up here around 65%, and then they break down in 2025. Or I could see a scenario where it overshoots the wedge, makes everyone truly become Bitcoin maxis, and then it drops. That's what I'm thinking. But this whole process, we've been talking about it for years. And now it's happening, and now everyone's getting on board. And as everyone gets on board, just remember the trend will start to subtly change. The other thing to remember, too, is that alt Bitcoin pairs have generally been tracking central bank net liquidity. So if you overlay net liquidity by central banks, and you just overlay this with alt Bitcoin pairs, it's almost a carbon copy, right? And this is going to keep going down as long as the dollar keeps rallying. And I told you guys a while back that the dollar would likely rally into the end of the year and early 2025, potentially. I don't know exactly how high it's going to go, but I could see it rallying up to 109, 110. Remember, in 2016, the dollar saw a really big rally starting in, here. I mean, in sort of October, it rallied up like 9-10%. It's already up 6%, right? If you rally up 9 or 10%, that gets it up to 110. So that was always the base case. And as long as the dollar goes up, central bank net liquidity goes down, because if you convert the central bank local currency into US dollars, if the US dollar is doing well, then that's where you get, that's how the central bank net liquidity goes down. And also the US is still in, the Fed is still in reducing the size of their balance sheet. So that's how that continues to go up. Therefore, if DXY goes up, we likely also see the long end of the yield curve go up. And it has been. And if the long end of the yield curve goes up, the dollar goes up, good chance Bitcoin dominance is going to go up. Because anytime the dollar gets these strong rallies, usually dominance follows, right? If you overlay Bitcoin dominance with the dollar, there's been plenty of times whenever the dollar goes on a strong rally, that's when Bitcoin dominance gets its really strong rallies. Like, look at this rally right here by the dollar. And then see here, that was where Bitcoin dominance went up aggressively. Now you're getting another Bitcoin dominance rally, and the dollar's also going up. So, I mean, this is something we've seen happen many, many times, right? Whenever the dollar goes up, usually Bitcoin dominance follows, because people will put their, they'll want to take on the less risk. They'll want to put it into the sort of the blue chip of the industry. So, yeah, that's where we are, guys. I mean, those are my thoughts on Bitcoin dominance. And right now we're at 61%. We'll see how high, in fact, it will go. I don't know the exact top. I wish I could tell you. Hopefully you understand why putting out price targets is so difficult, because whenever you put them out, eventually they get hit, and either they get hit or they don't. If they don't get hit, you get made fun of. If they go above that price target, you also get made fun of. I don't know exactly where it's going to go. 60% seemed like a conservative estimate 3 years ago. Now that it's at 61, it certainly could go higher. I mean, as long as alt Bitcoin pairs remain off their historic lows, it seems like that should be the base case, So, good chance we'll see it go a little bit higher into the end of the year, maybe even early 2025, but I do think it will start to turn around in the post-halving year. Remember, dominance has a pretty interesting trend here where it goes down for 1 year and then up for 3, right? Down for 1. I guess it also went down in 2016, but there weren't nearly as many altcoins back then, but at least what we saw last cycle, down for 1, up for 3, down for 1, up for 3. My guess is 2025 Bitcoin dominance goes down. That's my guess. Just like it did the last 2 post-halving years. So hopefully, if we do get alt season, you're able to preserve the Bitcoin valuation of your portfolio for the last 3 years and you didn't just watch those alts bleed back to the king. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Links in the description below. You can lock in the low rate. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.